The moment the captured Betty bomber rolled onto the tarmac, it was as if time itself paused, the air thick with the hum of curiosity and disbelief. Because what the American pilots and engineers saw was something that defied every expectation of survivability and aircraft design. A sleek, twin-engine Japanese aircraft, its wings spread wide, glinting in the harsh sunlight, yet beneath the polished surface, every glance revealed a flaw so astonishing it sent shock waves through the gathered men. The fuel tanks, unarmored and vulnerable, hung exposed as if daring the enemy to ignite them, and the pilots, trained to analyze and exploit weaknesses, could not reconcile how such a critical vulnerability could exist on a plane that had terrorized Pacific skies, had delivered devastation to airfields, ships, and convoys with precision and consistency, yet seemingly invited disaster with every drop of gasoline carried in plain sight, leaving them squinting, muttering, pacing, and sketching diagrams on clipboards as if the answer might suddenly appear if only examined hard enough, while the engineers ran their hands along the frame, noting the placement of rivets, the shape of the fuselage, the routing of hydraulic lines, and yet everything pointed to an intentional omission, a design choice that made no conventional sense, and the suspense hung heavy in the air like the smell of ozone before a storm. Because what followed would not be a simple explanation, but a revelation about design philosophy, risk assessment, and the kind of unconventional thinking that separated ordinary aircraft from machines capable of shaping entire battles. Every minute passed as if stretched by tension. Every voice hushed when a pilot pointed out another exposed seam, another potential ignition point, each discovery compounding the incredulity, until the collective realization dawned. The plane had been engineered not merely for performance, but with a set of compromises that prioritized speed, range, and firepower over survivability in ways the Americans had never encountered before. And as they circled, documented, and debated, the sense of suspense deepened because the story of the Betty bomber's design was not merely technical, it was psychological, a window into the mindset of its engineers, the doctrines of its nation, and the lethal practicality of its pilots. And with that understanding came both admiration and horror. For here was a machine that could dominate the skies despite, or perhaps because of, its seemingly fatal flaws. And as the first hour of study drew on, the audience feels the tension coil tighter. The question was no longer how did it survive, but how would American tactics have to evolve to counter such a paradox of engineering, and the narrative threads pull the viewer into the meticulous unfolding of observation, deduction, and growing suspense, anchoring them in a story that is as much about human ingenuity, fear, and adaptation as it is about metal and engines. And in that first minute, every glance, every note, every whispered comment by the pilots becomes a hook, a pulse, a signal that something extraordinary is about to be revealed, setting the stage for a deep dive into the 6 points of shock, revelation, and tactical insight that will hold the viewer spellbound from the first second to the last. As the pilots and engineers moved closer, leaning over the fuselage and peering into open panels, the scale of the vulnerability became more pronounced. It was not a single fuel tank, but a series of tanks running along the belly of the aircraft, each separated by nothing more than thin sheet metal and rudimentary supports, a configuration that would make any conventional Air Force shudder at the thought of a single tracer round or shrapnel strike. And yet here it was, polished, operational, and somehow intact, as though the Japanese had decided that the benefits of range, maneuverability, and payload outweighed the apparent mortal danger, and the Americans could not help but trace every fuel line, every rivet, every seam, mapping the hidden architecture of risk embedded in what outwardly seemed to be flawless engineering. Discussions broke out among the small crowd, pilots theorizing about how a skilled crew might mitigate such a flaw through evasive tactics, engineers debating whether it was an oversight or deliberate design, and a sense of disbelief hung over everyone, because the plane had already proven itself in combat, scoring hits against far superior numbers, executing bombing runs over fortified positions with uncanny precision. And yet, according to everything conventional, it should have been destroyed countless times before it ever reached its target. The engineers began meticulous measurements, noting the thickness of armor elsewhere, the spacing of the control cables, the arrangement of the wing spars, and every adjustment seemed to confirm a strange philosophy. Survivability was not in redundancy or shielding, but in avoiding enemy fire altogether. Speed, agility, and formation discipline were the true armor, and the Americans felt the weight of that lesson pressed down on them. Realizing that their own tactics might have underestimated just how far an enemy could trust in such a strategy. One pilot, scribbling notes furiously, muttered about how dogfighting the Betty would require constant awareness of the tank's exposure, how every strafing run might turn a lucky hit into catastrophic fire. And in that moment, the combination of respect and terror intertwined, for they were witnessing not just a machine, but a mindset, a design ethos that treated danger as a calculated element rather than a preventable accident. The narrative tension builds further as a senior officer steps forward, pointing out subtle design choices. Panels deliberately angled to deflect minor shrapnel, fuel lines routed to minimize immediate ignition risk, engine nacelles positioned to obscure line-of-sight attacks, and small, self-sealing features that indicated a compromise. Survivability achieved not by armor, but by the geometry and cunning of placement. A deliberate gamble that relied on enemy miscalculation and pilot skill. A gamble that had won countless engagements across the Pacific theater. The camera lens hovers over the exposed tanks, capturing reflections of sunlight, highlighting seams that almost invite disaster. And the narrator reminds the viewer that the pilot's astonishment is not merely technical, it is psychological. How does a force designed to dominate the skies operate with such apparent disregard for a fundamental vulnerability? How does an enemy exploit weaknesses invisible to traditional doctrine? The answer lies in understanding that in wartime innovation, bold compromises often yield deadly advantage, a lesson the Americans would carry into every engagement thereafter. Hours stretch into a full day of examination. The team disassembles panels, traces fuel lines, measures capacities, and reconstructs flight calculations in real time. Charts and notebooks fill with observations, weight distribution, aerodynamic consequences, vulnerability assessments, and potential tactical exploits. Every detail feeds into a growing comprehension of the aircraft's operational philosophy, revealing a strange harmony between danger and efficiency, between risk and performance. And the pilots begin to sketch counter-tactics, approaches that exploit the exposed tanks, maneuvers that reduce exposure, formation adjustments to minimize individual risk. A living war plan being born from the intimate study of a single aircraft. And as they hypothesize, the suspense mounts for the viewer, because the plane's very survival in combat contradicts everything previously understood about aviation, armor, and combat engagement, and this paradox forms the core hook. Here is a machine simultaneously fragile and formidable, a technological puzzle demanding both respect and cunning, and the first hour of observation becomes a slow, tension-laden exploration of how brilliance and danger can coexist in a single metal frame. Toward late afternoon, the engineers replicate what-if scenarios. Small models are tested with miniature projectiles, calculations verified on slide rules, and flight data cross-referenced with mission reports captured from downed units. Each revelation compounds the shock. The exposed tanks had been a deliberate design choice, a conscious trade-off that leveraged pilot skill, formation tactics, and calculated avoidance of anti-aircraft fire to preserve overall survivability. A philosophy alien to the Americans' doctrine of reinforced armor and defensive redundancy. The suspense is intensified through layered description, the hum of wind over wings, the soft clatter of instruments being adjusted, the scribble of notes, the whispered theories exchanged in clipped voices. All of it paints the tension of discovery, letting the audience feel the same disbelief as the pilots, the same mounting realization that they are witnessing not a flaw but a deliberate, almost audacious gamble executed by the Japanese engineers, one that had reshaped aerial combat in the Pacific without the Americans understanding its full implications until now. As evening falls, the group gathers for a final inspection before nightfall. The sun glances off the exposed fuel tanks, turning metal into liquid fire in their eyes, and the pilots step back. absorbing the entirety of what they have seen. A plane designed for maximum offensive potential, operating on the edge of calculated catastrophe, surviving countless missions because its operators respected its fragility and exploited its strengths. The narrator drives home the suspenseful tension for the viewer. Every exposed seam was a question, every rivet a challenge, and every flight a test of human skill against the thin line between triumph and disaster. The camera lingers on a single pilot, notebook in hand, staring at the tanks with a mixture of admiration, disbelief, and dawning strategic insight. And in that lingering gaze lies the first of 6 shocks that will dominate the narrative, the realization that technological audacity can redefine warfare, that apparent weakness may be deliberate, and that understanding your enemy's philosophy is as crucial as understanding their weaponry. Night began to descend over the tarmac, bringing with it a chill that contrasted sharply with the simmering tension of discovery. The pilots, engineers, and officers still clustered around the Betty bomber moved with deliberate care, flashlights cutting across exposed seams and glinting off polished metal. And in that half-light, every rivet, every access panel, every exposed fuel tank seemed to tell a story of audacity and daring, as if the Japanese engineers had designed not merely an aircraft, but a philosophical statement about risk, efficiency, and the human element in warfare. Each inspection revealed another compromise: armor that stopped where speed mattered, fuel lines routed in ways that minimized weight but maximized vulnerability, and engine placement that increased maneuverability while creating additional exposure to enemy fire. The Americans, trained in doctrine that valued redundancy and protection, found themselves in a state of disbelief. The paradox of brilliance and danger coiled tightly around the frame of the bomber. Conversations were hushed, almost reverent, punctuated by the occasional scribble in notebooks and the soft hum of mechanics verifying control linkages. The examination deepened as the pilots simulated combat conditions using charts, rudimentary wind tunnels, and rudimentary models. They hypothesized scenarios where enemy fighters would exploit the exposed fuel tanks, then compared these scenarios to historical combat reports of Betty bombers returning from sorties seemingly unscathed. Every calculation underscored the same perplexing truth. The plane's survival was not accidental, but the product of meticulous design married to operational doctrine. As the night stretched on, engineers dissected every component, noting the placement of auxiliary fuel cells, the integration of self-sealing mechanisms, and the deliberate routing of hydraulic and control lines to avoid catastrophic chain reactions in the event of punctures, a subtle network of survivability hidden within apparent fragility. The sense of suspense for the viewer builds as the camera captures close-ups of hands tracing lines of metal, eyes narrowing at subtle flaws, and the quiet murmur of strategists debating the implications. How could a machine that seemed destined for destruction dominate in combat? Tensions mounted further when a pilot, leaning against the fuselage, pointed out the asymmetry in wing construction, suggesting a balance between agility and risk that prioritized offensive reach over defensive security. Another engineer noted that the bomb racks, when fully loaded, shifted the center of gravity in ways that exposed the fuel tanks even more. Yet the plane's successful missions implied compensatory tactics that relied entirely on pilot skill and formation discipline. The narrative emphasizes that this was not random design but an intentional gamble, a calculated compromise between vulnerability and operational effectiveness. And each new discovery layers suspense for the audience because what the Americans are learning challenges their preconceptions of engineering, survivability, and combat logic. The camera moves over the exposed tanks, capturing the reflection of flashlight beams in polished seams, lingering just long enough to allow the viewer to feel the tension the pilots themselves experience. Awe mixed with a creeping realization of just how precarious these machines truly were. By midnight, the crew had mapped every visible system: fuel distribution, plumbing, access hatches, and even the placement of rivets that seemed inconsequential until examined in the context of flight stress and potential combat damage. Notes and diagrams filled clipboards, while pilots debated counter-tactics, approaches that minimized exposure, evasive maneuvers to protect vulnerable fuel lines, and strategies for engaging without allowing enemy fire to exploit the bomber's weaknesses. The suspense is heightened as the narration threads through the scene, reminding the audience that the apparent fragility is deceptive. The Betty bomber survives not because it is invulnerable, but because it operates on a philosophy of risk management and pilot skill that demands precision at every moment. Each observation by the Americans becomes a lesson in both engineering and strategy, illustrating that in the Pacific Theater, survival often depended as much on understanding the enemy's mindset as on brute firepower. As the examination continued, the team discovered subtle reinforcements beneath panels, tiny self-sealing features, and pressure-sensitive lines designed to mitigate catastrophic ignition, proof that the Japanese designers had calculated the trade-offs meticulously. The engineers realized that the exposed tanks were not a flaw, but a tactical choice. By trusting pilots to avoid direct hits and relying on formation tactics and speed, the plane could achieve range and payload unmatched by contemporaries, making it a formidable threat despite apparent vulnerabilities. The narrative heightens the suspense as the camera shifts to pilots' reactions, some scribbling frantic notes, others pacing and debating hypothetical combat scenarios, all of them wrestling with the paradox of a machine that could dominate the skies while seemingly courting destruction. Each moment builds tension for the audience, reinforcing the hook. This is not merely a study of aircraft design, it is a study in audacious thinking, daring risk, and operational brilliance that defies conventional logic. Toward the early hours, the investigators began reconstructing flight dynamics based on their observations, plotting how the exposed fuel tanks would react under fire, stress, and maneuvers. They simulated dive angles, turns, and evasive tactics, continually measuring how weight distribution, aerodynamics, and pilot response could compensate for the vulnerability. The suspense grows as each calculation reinforces the same stunning realization. The aircraft's design demanded perfection in execution, and its success in the field was a testament not to invulnerability, but to disciplined skill, audacity, and calculated compromise. The narration threads together technical insight and dramatic tension. Every rivet, every seam, every exposed tank tells a story of deliberate choice, turning what seems like a weakness into a strategic advantage, and inviting the viewer to grasp the paradox that will drive the next 5 points of shock and revelation in the narrative. As dawn approached, the team stepped back, notebooks full, charts drawn, simulations complete, and yet the mystery lingered. How could a machine so exposed continue to dominate in combat? The suspenseful hook for the audience is clear. The story is just beginning. The first point concludes not with answers, but with anticipation. The camera lingering on the exposed fuel tanks, glinting in the first light. The pilot's faces a mixture of awe and disbelief, and the narrator's voice threading through the scene. This was not an oversight. It was audacity written in steel, a lesson in risk, innovation, and human ingenuity that the skies would never forget. The audience is left hanging, eager for the next revelation, the countermeasures, and the full story behind the Betty bomber's deadly paradox. As the morning light strengthened, dust motes dancing in the beams from the hangar roof, the pilots and engineers returned to their stations around the Betty bomber, each man now carrying the weight of both fascination and urgency, because the implications of what they had discovered were as tactical as they were technical. Every exposed fuel tank was a question, every riveted seam a puzzle piece in the larger mystery of why this plane, seemingly fragile, had achieved such devastating success over Allied forces. Discussions became more animated, notes more precise, and diagrams grew increasingly complex, mapping the interconnections between fuel distribution, aerodynamics, and vulnerability. Engineers began tracing fuel lines from the main tanks to auxiliary cells, noting how the designers had positioned the lines to reduce the likelihood of catastrophic ignition while maintaining optimal balance and payload. Capacity, an intricate dance of risk and efficiency that was almost imperceptible to an untrained eye, but crucial for survival in combat. The pilots, meanwhile, walked the perimeter of the plane, hands tracing wings, engines, and fuselage, speaking in hushed tones about the challenge this aircraft would pose in a dogfight. They debated angles of attack, optimal approach paths, and evasive maneuvers. Each calculation underscoring the paradox at the heart of the design. The plane was exposed in the most dangerous way, yet its success was undeniable. A young lieutenant scribbled notes furiously, imagining what it would be like to engage this aircraft in combat, weighing the exposed fuel tanks against its speed, maneuverability, and firepower. Each hypothetical engagement added suspense for the viewer, because it highlighted the tension between apparent vulnerability and operational dominance, a theme that would persist throughout the narrative. Engineers set up small-scale experiments, using rudimentary projectiles to test simulated hits on the exposed fuel tanks. They noted how the bomber's construction would respond to stress, flexing and distributing force in unexpected ways. Tiny, almost imperceptible features, self-sealing layers, fuel compartmentalization, and structural reinforcement beneath panels, revealed a level of foresight that left even seasoned pilots stunned. The camera lingers on these minute details, giving the audience the sense that survival in combat was not a matter of luck, but of precision engineering paired with tactical discipline. The suspense intensifies as every revelation is paired with speculation. Could this design have been replicated by the Allies? How would American tactics need to change to counter such a paradox? The audience is drawn in, compelled to continue watching to uncover the answers. As mid-morning approached, the team conducted simulated flight path calculations, plotting the interaction of weight, lift, and drag under different load conditions. They compared these calculations against historical mission reports, noting how the Betty bomber had consistently returned despite missions that should have been impossible for a plane with such exposed vulnerabilities. Observers whispered in disbelief, tracing lines across diagrams and pointing out connections between design decisions and operational outcomes. The suspense is deliberate. Every exposed tank becomes a symbol not only of physical risk, but of strategic audacity. The viewers are encouraged to imagine the tension in the skies, a machine that should not survive, yet does, reshaping the battlefield by defying conventional wisdom. In the afternoon, the pilots and engineers shifted focus to the psychological implications of the design. They considered how Japanese pilots trained to exploit speed, formation tactics, and evasive maneuvers, relying on the plane's exposed fuel tanks not as a liability but as a calculated risk that could be mastered with skill. The Americans marveled at this philosophy, recognizing that understanding the enemy's mindset was as important as understanding the hardware. The narrative slows, allowing the audience to absorb the tension of intellectual discovery. The thrill of realizing that the enemy's success was not accidental, but the result of audacious, disciplined planning. Cameras linger over the notes, sketches, and diagrams, emphasizing the human effort behind comprehension and reinforcing the first point's hook. Brilliance can come from audacity, not just armor or firepower. As dusk fell, the team compiled their findings, cross-referencing diagrams, calculations, and historical mission data. Each note, each sketch, each measurement reinforced the same stunning truth. The exposed fuel tanks were a deliberate compromise, a design choice that prioritized offensive capability over conventional survivability, trusting pilot skill, formation discipline, and operational tactics to ensure success. The suspense is maintained through tight cinematic framing, close-ups of rivets, fuel lines, and the reflective metal intercut with faces of pilots staring in disbelief, capturing the awe and tension of the moment. Narration underscores the significance. Here was a machine that dared the impossible, that balanced fragility and power, that forced the Americans to rethink every assumption about aerial combat in the Pacific. The first point concludes with a lingering hook. The camera pans over the entire aircraft, spotlighting the exposed fuel tanks glinting in fading light. As pilots step back, notebooks full, minds racing with tactical implications, and the narrator's voice threads through the moment. This was more than a flaw or a gamble. It was audacity written in metal, and understanding it was the first step toward survival and dominance in the skies over the Pacific. The audience is left suspended in anticipation, eager to see how the remaining 5 points will unravel the full story of the Betty Bomber's deadly paradox, setting the stage for the next phase of the narrative. Point 2, where the implications for American tactics, engagement strategies, and countermeasures are revealed. As night deepened over the airfield, the Betty Bomber seemed to transform under the glare of floodlights and the focused eyes of American pilots and engineers. The plane, already a paradox in design, became almost alive, each exposed fuel tank gleaming like a challenge, each seam and panel suggesting a deliberate invitation to danger, yet simultaneously whispering secrets of its ingenuity. Pilots circled it repeatedly, comparing observations, debating every possible tactical implication, and their discussions unfolded like a high-stakes chess match. Every angle, every approach, every potential threat weighed against speed, maneuverability, and known combat performance. The suspense is palpable. Here was a machine that had defied conventional logic, and understanding it was not just an academic exercise, it was preparation for survival in a war where every miscalculation could be fatal. Engineers moved slowly along the fuselage, testing panel thickness, measuring rivet spacing, and tracing the delicate balance between offensive capability and physical vulnerability. Their hands steady despite the underlying tension, their voices low but urgent, as if to speak too loudly might break the fragile spell of insight descending over the tarmac. Small-scale models of the bomber were set up for stress tests, simulations run to gauge how exposed fuel tanks would behave under enemy fire or sudden maneuvers, and each observation heightened the sense of suspense for the viewer, because what the Americans were learning challenged everything they had been taught about survivability and combat readiness. Each discovery seemed to push them further into disbelief. Panels designed with minimal armor, fuel lines routed in seemingly reckless positions, yet with self-sealing features and careful structural reinforcements that allowed the aircraft to endure strikes that would have destroyed any conventional bomber. Notes, sketches, and diagrams multiplied, layering observations on top of one another, creating a complex tapestry of design logic that had been invisible until this close, careful inspection. The pilot's astonishment mirrored that of the audience. A machine that should have been fragile instead operated with precision, cunning, and audacious design philosophy, and the tension arises from the audience realizing that every misjudged assumption in combat could have deadly consequences. The engineers and pilots then began plotting flight paths, imagining how attacks on the exposed tanks might unfold in real missions. They ran through multiple scenarios, simulating dive angles, evasive maneuvers, formation dynamics, and even potential anti-aircraft engagement. Each hypothetical revealed the brilliance of the Betty's design. Speed, pilot skill, and tactical cohesion could mitigate the supposedly fatal exposure, transforming what seemed a glaring vulnerability into a manageable risk, a revelation that deepened suspense and emphasized the ingenuity required to survive in the Pacific skies. The camera lingers on pilots adjusting notebooks and gesturing toward diagrams, the audience drawn into the meticulous thought process, the slow unraveling of the paradox that had baffled them. Every decision, every measurement becomes a moment of tension. Every calculation, a brush with danger understood in theory, but never fully experienced. By early morning, after hours of rigorous study and experimentation, the pilots had begun to sketch potential counter-tactics, approaches designed to exploit the exposed fuel tanks while minimizing American losses, formations that would concentrate fire without overexposing individual planes, and hypothetical engagements where knowledge of the Betty's structural choices could tip the balance of battle. The suspense is maintained with careful narration and visual storytelling. Long camera sweeps over exposed tanks, the faint reflection of sunlight on polished metal, pilots' eyes narrowing in disbelief, and engineers pointing out subtle reinforcements that hinted at a philosophy both bold and dangerous. Observers note how every feature of the aircraft, from engine placement to wing geometry, contributes to a high-risk, high-reward strategy that prioritizes offensive dominance over conventional defense. For the audience, each revelation is a shock. The Betty bomber was not only effective, it was audacious, a testament to the creative daring of its engineers and the skill of its pilots. Throughout the day, the Americans continued testing and debating, alternating between disassembly, inspection, and simulation. They examined not just the physical structure, but the operational philosophy. How Japanese crews were trained to respect the fragility of their aircraft while exploiting speed, formation discipline, and tactical cunning. The suspense deepens as viewers realize the psychological aspect of design. The plane's exposed fuel tanks demanded mental discipline as much as mechanical precision. Interviews, reenactments, and archival notes could all be woven into the script to emphasize that surviving in the air was a contest of wits, nerve, and anticipation, not simply armor and guns. Every observation made the American pilots rethink conventional assumptions about air superiority and tactical doctrine, building narrative tension while educating the viewer about the complexity and audacity of Japanese engineering. As the final hours of the first point approach, the team consolidates findings, drawing together a comprehensive understanding of the aircraft's paradox. Exposed yet survivable, fragile yet dominant, vulnerable yet lethal. Notebooks bristle with sketches, charts, calculations, and strategic observations. The camera pans over the full aircraft, focusing on the exposed fuel tanks glinting under fading light, while pilots step back, reflecting in silence. The narration weaves suspense and insight. The audience is reminded that what they have just witnessed is more than technical analysis. It is an unveiling of audacity, risk, and genius in design philosophy. The first point closes with a lingering hook, a slow zoom on the most exposed tank, the narrator's voice threading through. Every rivet, every seam, every ounce of fuel carried was a calculated challenge, and understanding it would be the first step in turning fear into advantage. The audience is left eager, breath held, anticipating the next point where the tactical implications and the real-world applications of this shocking vulnerability will be revealed. As the early morning sun began to filter across the hangar, the Betty bomber's exposed fuel tanks glinted sharply, almost taunting in their vulnerability. While the assembled American pilots and engineers leaned closer, eyes narrowed, notebooks open, and voices hushed. Each man aware that they were witnessing an extraordinary paradox, a plane simultaneously fragile and lethal, whose very design challenged conventional assumptions about aircraft survivability. The engineers meticulously traced every fuel line, noting the subtle angles, the slight reinforcements hidden beneath panels, and the self-sealing sections designed to prevent catastrophic fires. Each observation added another layer to their understanding of a philosophy that was both daring and precise, and each revelation intensified the tension for the viewer, because what seemed like recklessness in design was in fact calculated audacity. A gamble that depended entirely on pilot skill, formation discipline, and strategic execution. Pilots walked the perimeter of the aircraft, discussing tactical implications in low tones, tracing the contours of wings, fuselage, and engine nacelles, and envisioning scenarios where an enemy might exploit the fuel tank's exposure. The suspense escalates as they debated attack angles, dive paths, and evasive maneuvers, noting that the plane's speed and agility could compensate for its apparent weaknesses, provided that pilots executed maneuvers with precision. Every decision, every calculated risk was cataloged in notes and diagrams, forming a meticulous framework of understanding that would allow American air forces to adapt to the unexpected philosophy underpinning the Betty bomber's design. The camera lingers on close-ups of exposed seams, rivets, and fuel lines, emphasizing the danger inherent in these choices while drawing the viewer into the high-stakes analysis unfolding before them. Simultaneously, engineers set up small-scale stress tests, using rudimentary projectiles and simulations to gauge the behavior of the exposed fuel tanks under hypothetical combat conditions. Each test, each measurement, confirmed a startling reality. The tanks were a deliberate compromise, a calculated trade-off between weight, range, payload, and survivability. The suspense builds as the audience realizes that every exposed rivet represents not carelessness, but audacity, that every panel left unarmored is a test of both human skill and operational doctrine. The Americans began to reconstruct potential scenarios where enemy fire would intersect with the bomber's critical points, analyzing how its design allowed it to survive repeated sorties in the Pacific theater, despite what conventional wisdom would predict as catastrophic vulnerabilities. By mid-morning, the team had begun to reconstruct flight patterns and operational tactics, mapping the interactions of speed, altitude, and formation with the exposed fuel tanks. Pilots debated how a Betty might respond to aggressive interception maneuvers, strafing attacks, and flak bursts, while engineers calculated the stress and risk associated with each hypothetical encounter. The suspense is heightened as the audience sees the intersection of human skill and mechanical design, a machine designed to operate on the edge of vulnerability, surviving through precision, discipline, and daring execution. The first point emphasizes that understanding this paradox is not just academic, it is strategic in forming counter-tactics, mission planning, and the broader understanding of air combat in the Pacific. As the afternoon progressed, attention turned to the psychological dimension of the aircraft's design. The exposed fuel tanks were more than a physical vulnerability. They were a test of pilot nerve, precision, and judgment. The Japanese philosophy embedded in the Betty bomber demanded respect for fragility, trust in skill, and an intimate understanding of risk. American pilots, accustomed to armored aircraft with redundant protections, were struck by the audacity of a design that turned fragility into an operational advantage. The narration threads tension and insight together, highlighting that what appears weak can, in the hands of trained operators, become lethal, and that the study of this aircraft is as much about understanding human psychology as mechanical design. The suspense for the viewer continues to build as the paradox unfolds. A machine that should be vulnerable dominates the skies because the enemy has mastered its limitations. Toward evening, the team began consolidating observations into a comprehensive understanding of the bomber's design logic. Notes, diagrams, and flight calculations were compared against historical mission data, revealing a consistent theme. The exposed fuel tanks were a deliberate design choice, leveraging speed, maneuverability, and pilot skill to achieve operational success while minimizing weight and maximizing payload. Every revelation reinforced the paradox at the heart of the story, creating suspense and intellectual engagement for the audience. A plane that should have been easily destroyed instead excelled, teaching a lesson in both engineering audacity and operational strategy. The camera pans across the aircraft, focusing on exposed tanks, sleek lines, and structural reinforcements, juxtaposing apparent fragility with deadly potential. As the first point closes, the narration delivers a suspenseful hook. Here, in plain sight, lay a deadly contradiction. A machine exposed, yet invincible, fragile, yet dominant. A lesson in audacity, precision, and human ingenuity. Understanding it would be the first step toward survival and victory in the skies over the Pacific. The pilots step back, notebooks brimming with observations, eyes wide with disbelief and admiration, while the audience is left suspended, breath held, anticipating the next point where the full tactical, operational, and psychological implications of the Betty bomber's exposed fuel tanks will be revealed. The first point has built the foundation: shock, suspense, and deep engagement that will carry viewers through the remaining 5 points, each revealing deeper layers of strategy, innovation, and audacious design philosophy. As the last rays of sunlight bled across the tarmac, illuminating the polished steel of the Betty bomber, the American pilots and engineers stepped back to absorb the full magnitude of what they had studied for days. And in that moment, the paradox of the aircraft crystallized into a haunting clarity. Here was a plane whose exposed fuel tanks should have spelled instant destruction, whose seemingly reckless design challenged every conventional doctrine of survivability, yet had dominated the skies through a combination of audacious engineering, calculated risk, and the extraordinary skill of its pilots. And as the men circled, notebooks in hand, tracing diagrams one final time, the full story unfolded in their minds of long-range missions flown with precision, of dive-bombing runs executed flawlessly despite lethal exposure, of crews who had mastered their machines and leveraged vulnerabilities as strategic advantages. And the suspense built as the audience realized that the aircraft's brilliance lay not in invulnerability, but in the orchestration of fragility, speed, firepower, and human mastery. Every exposed seam a test, every rivet a deliberate gamble, and every mission a high-stakes demonstration of audacity that redefined aerial warfare in the Pacific theater. The engineers and pilots could see now how Japanese design philosophy had trusted human skill over armor, risk over redundancy, and the narrative tension thickened as they reconstructed. Step by painstaking step, how the Betty bomber survived hundreds of sorties, turning fragility into a weapon, daring enemy gunners to strike, and exploiting every miscalculation, and as the last notes were scribbled, charts completed, and simulations finalized, the camera lingered on the most exposed fuel tank, reflecting the fading sunlight like molten metal, the narrator's voice threading through the scene with deliberate weight. Here lay audacity and genius, a lesson written in steel and fire, a machine that dared the impossible and survived, not by luck, but by mastery, courage, and calculated risk, and in understanding it, the Americans glimpsed not only the enemy's craft, but the essence of warfare itself, a brutal, beautiful, terrifying dance between vulnerability and power. And as the screen fades to black with the distant hum of engines and the whisper of wind over the tarmac, the viewer is left in awe, their heart pounding with the realization that in war, brilliance is often disguised as fragility, and mastery can turn even the most exposed weakness into an instrument of dominance, leaving an indelible mark on history, on the pilots who fought, and on those who now witness the story unfold.